Hello and welcome back to the channel. This third video of the Freud series is titled Other Appreciations of Collective Mental Life. Let's dive in. We have used Le Bon's account as an introduction because, in its emphasis on the unconscious life of the mind, it chimes so neatly with our own psychology. However, we do need to add that, in fact, none of the assertions made by this author contributes anything new. Everything adverse and disparaging that he says about expression of the mass mind had already been said by others before him, with the same finality and the same hostility. It has been reiterated in identical terms since the earliest days of literature by thinkers, statesmen, and poets. The two propositions containing Le Bon's most important views, that of the collective inhibition of intellectual performance and that of the heightening of affectivity within the mass, had been formulated by Sagalé slightly earlier. Basically, the only things left as peculiar to Le Bon are the two standpoints of the unconscious and the comparison with the mental life of primitives, though these two had of course been touched on many times before him. Also, however, the description and appreciation of the mass mind given by Le Bon and the others have by no means gone unchallenged. There is no doubt that all the phenomena of the mass mind described above had been correctly observed. But other expressions of mass formation having precisely the opposite effect can also be identified, and from these a very much higher assessment of the mass mind must be deduced. Le Bon himself was prepared to concede that the morality of the mass may in certain circumstances be higher than that of the individuals making it up, and that only collective entities are capable of a high degree of selflessness and dedication. Personal interest is very rarely a powerful motive force with crowds, while it is almost the exclusive motive of the conduct of the isolated individual. Others assert that it is in fact only society that lays down the standards of morality for the individual, whereas the individual, as a rule, somehow falls behind these high demands. Or that in exceptional circumstances, the phenomenon of enthusiasm will occur in a collectivity, which in the past has made the most splendid mass achievements possible. As regards intellectual achievement, it is true that the great decisions of mental endeavor, the discoveries and solutions that truly matter, are possible only for the individual working in isolation. But the mass mind, too, is capable of inspired intellectual creations. Witness above all language itself, but also folksong, folklore, and other things besides. Moreover, it is an open question how much the individual thinker or writer owes to the stimuli of the mass within which he lives, whether he is any more than the perfecter of a mental effort to which at the same time others have contributed. Given these total contradictions, in fact, it would seem that the work of mass psychology must proceed in vain. Yet it is a simple matter to find a more hopeful way out of the problem. Probably what has happened is that very different formations have been lumped together as masses, and that these need to be distinguished from one another. The remarks of Sagalé, Le Bon, and others relate to masses of a short-lived kind that form rapidly from individuals of different types as a result of a transient interest. Quite clearly, their accounts were influenced by the nature of revolutionary masses, particularly those of the Great French Revolution. The contrary assertions stem from evaluations of the stable masses, or social entities in which people spend their lives, and that are embodied in the institutions of society. Masses of the first kind sit on the back of the latter, so to speak, as short but high waves ride the longer swell of the sea. McDougall, who in his book The Group Mind takes the above contradiction as his starting point, finds the solution of the same in the organization factor. In the simplest case, what he calls the group has no organization at all or none to speak of. Such a mass he describes as a crowd. He admits, however, that a crowd does not readily assemble without at least the beginnings of organization taking shape within it, and that it is in just such simple masses that many of the fundamental facts of collective psychology are particularly easily discernible. If members of a crowd who have drifted together by chance are to form anything like a mass in the psychological sense, it is necessary for those members to have something in common, a shared interest in some object, a similar emotional orientation in a specific situation, and, I would add, therefore, some degree of reciprocal influence between the members of the group. The stronger this mental homogeneity, the more readily a psychological mass will be formed from those individuals, and the more striking will be the external manifestations of what we may term a mass mind. Now, the oddest and at the same time the most important phenomenon of mass formation is the way in which it stimulates in each individual an exaltation or intensification of emotion. It is possible, according to McDougall, to say that people's affects rarely, in different circumstances, rise to the heights they may attain in a mass. In fact, it is an enjoyable experience for those concerned to abandon themselves so unreservedly to their passions, and in the process be swallowed up in the mass, losing their feeling of individual separateness. McDougall explains this feeling on the part of individuals of being carried away in terms of what he calls the principle of direct induction of emotion by way of the primitive sympathetic response. In other words, the emotional contagion we have already encountered. The fact is, the perceived signs of an affective state are such as automatically to evoke the same affect in the person doing the perceiving. This automatic compulsion will be the stronger, the more people are seen to exhibit the same effect simultaneously. The individual's critical faculties will then fall silent, and he will allow himself to slip into the same affective state. In the process, however, he will heighten the excitement of the others who had aroused him, and thus the individual's own affective charge will increase as a result of reciprocal induction. Unmistakably in evidence, here is a kind of compulsion to match others, to stay in tune with the many. The coarser, simpler emotions have more chance of spreading through a mass in this way. This mechanism of affect enhancement is further assisted by a number of other influences proceeding from the mass. The mass impresses the individual as an untamed force and an invincible threat. Momentarily, it has taken the place of the whole of human society, which is the seat of authority, whose punishments are feared, and for whose sake individuals have inflicted so many inhibitions upon themselves. There is clearly danger in opposing the mass, and safety for the individual lies in following the example of those around him. If need be, even running with the pack. In obedience to the new authority, a person may disable his earlier conscience, yielding to the lure of the pleasurable sensations he can be sure of gaining through a removal of his inhibitions. On the whole, then, it is not so strange that we should see the individual in the mass doing or sanctioning things on which, in his customary living conditions, that same individual would have turned his back. And we may even entertain the hope of being able in this way to lift something of the shadow so often cast by that enigmatic word, suggestion. The proposition of the low order of intelligence within the mass is one that McDougall, too, does not contradict. He says that lesser intelligences pull greater ones down to their level. The latter are inhibited in their operation because the enhancement of affectivity in any case creates unfavorable conditions for correct intellectual work. Also because individuals are intimidated by the mass and their thinking lacks freedom. And because for each individual, awareness of responsibility for his performance is diminished. McDougall's overall verdict regarding the psychical performance of a simple, unorganized mass is no kinder than that handed down by Le Bon. Such a mass is extremely excitable, impulsive, passionate, fickle, inconsistent, irresolute, but at the same time prepared to take extreme action, susceptible only to the coarser passions and more basic feelings. Exceptionally suggestible, foolish in its thinking, vehement in its opinions, capable of taking in only the simplest and hastiest conclusions and arguments, easily influenced, easily unsettled, lacking in self-awareness, self-respect, and any sense of responsibility, but ready, in its awareness of its own strength, to be dragged into all sorts of atrocities such as might be expected only from an absolute, irresponsible power. In other words, it tends to behave like an ill-mannered child, or like an impassioned, unsupervised savage in an unfamiliar situation. In the worst instances, its behavior bears more resemblance to that of a pack of wild animals than to that of human beings. Since McDougall contrasts the conduct of highly organized masses with that described here, we shall be particularly interested to learn in what such organization consists and by what factors it is engendered. The author lists 5 such principal conditions for the mental life of the mass to be raised to a higher level. The first fundamental condition is a measure of continuity in the existence of the mass. This may be substantive or formal. Substantive if the same people remain in the mass for some time. Formal if within the mass, certain positions have evolved that are allocated to individuals who succeed one another. The second is that a specific conception of the nature, function, attainments, and aspirations of the mass should have taken shape within the individual member in such a way that, for that individual, an emotional relationship with the mass as a whole can result. The third is that the mass should come into contact, for example, through competition, with other similar collective entities that nevertheless differ from it in many respects. The fourth is that the mass should possess traditions, customs, and institutions, particularly such as bear on the relationship of its members one with another. The fifth is that within the mass, there should exist a structure that finds expression in the specialization and differentiation of what each individual is expected to do. When these conditions are met, says McDougall, the psychical disadvantages of mass formation are removed. People protect themselves against the collective diminution of intellectual performance by taking the solving of intellectual tasks away from the mass and reserving it to individuals within the mass. It seems to us that the condition McDougall described as the organization of the mass can, with greater justification, be described in different terms. The task consists in conferring upon the mass the very qualities that once characterized the individual, and that, so far as the individual is concerned, formation of the mass effaced. Because the individual, outside the primitive mass, possessed continuity, self-awareness, traditions, and habits, a special job to do and a special place to occupy, he kept himself apart from others with whom he was in contention. For a while, as a result of joining the non-organized mass, the individual had lost these qualities. Accepting, then, that the aim is to furnish masses with the attributes of the individual, we are reminded of a profound remark made by Wilfred Trotter, who saw the tendency towards mass formation as a biological extension of the multicellular makeup of all higher organisms. If you enjoyed this video, you might want to check the books available in our link in the description. There you'll find many fundamental marketing books in different languages. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more psychology-related content. See you in the next one.